This is Dom Bettinelli, the CEO of SQPN, with a brief but very important message. For more than a decade, SQPN has produced the Catholic faith and pop culture podcasts that you love. We're a nonprofit organization, so it's only your generosity that lets us carry out our mission. We haven't run a fundraiser in 2 years, and that's why we need to ask for your help right now. Please make a pledge of whatever amount you can afford to help us continue providing your favorite podcasts, as well as exciting new ones we have planned. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give. Thank you for your generosity. May we hear from you today? You're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek episode number 20.
Captain to bridge.
Spock here.
Make it so. Surrender is not an option.
Attention crew of the Enterprise, this is James Kirk.
We are all explorers, driven to know what's over the horizon, what's beyond our own shores.
We would have helped you get home if you had asked. That's who Starfleet is.
Hi, I'm Dom Bettinelli, and you're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, where we discuss the hidden layers and deeper meanings found in all the Star Trek TV series, movies, and more. Today we're discussing the original pilot episode of the original series called The Cage. And we'll explain what that means, why you have to make that distinction in just a second. But joining me today on the panel are Jimmy Aiken. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
And Father Corey Stika. Hi, Father Corey.
How's it going?
So, but before we get into it, I just want to say to folks, please, like I've said before, remember to like, share, recommend, write reviews, and subscribe to the podcast in all the different places. Your response to the show is great. We even before we started airing the new episodes, we started getting subscribers to the feed, and that's been great. So we're looking forward to growing our audience, and you're a key part of that. So thank you very much. So, folks, The Cage was the first attempt by Gene Roddenberry and Desilu Studios in creating a new TV series called Star Trek.
Yeah, so let's talk for just a second about the background of that.
Yeah.
Originally, Gene Roddenberry, he'd had kind of a varied career. He'd been a pilot, he'd been a cop, and he'd gotten into writing TV shows. He wrote for a show called Paladin. Or I'm sorry, Have Gun Will Travel, which featured Paladin. Mm-hmm. And he then got his own show, which was called The Lieutenant, and did not last very long because of his famously prickly relations with studios. They didn't like working with him because he was so high maintenance and defiant, frankly. And he then he shopped the idea for Star Trek around. Desilu, founded by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, displayed some interest, but they weren't too sure about it. And eventually Lucille Ball herself stepped in and greenlit it. So they went to pilot, and they did this initial pilot called The Cage, which they came back and the network thought it was too cerebral, which it says something about the state of television at the time. Things are way more cerebral than this now.
I mean, if you think it's considered an idiot box today, can you imagine what it was like then?
Yeah. But they didn't, for almost any other series, that would have been the end of it. You produce a pilot, they said, we don't like it, and that's the end. But in this case, they took the very unusual step for either then or now of commissioning a second pilot that made changes. And that resulted in Where No Man Had Gone Before. And after that, they liked it enough, the second pilot, that they greenlit the series. And that's how we got the original series.
Right. And this all took place in 1964. That's when this, and not only do they retool the story, they changed the cast,
and the ship.
And the ship, right? The design, the interior design of it. But
yeah, because I was gonna say the exterior is very similar. It did get a coat of paint. It does look different, but but the basic shape and design and everything is recognizably the NCCC 1701 Enterprise.
Yep.
Yeah, though you'll see various accoutrements that are different. Like they've got those snaky desk monitors, the little tiny ones that look like those Luxo lamps.
Yes,
and there's a sunroof in the Enterprise, which you see right at the beginning.
We'll talk about that. Yeah, that's really cool.
Well, and some of the interior spaces, like the captain's quarters, are very different and that sort of thing as well. And they also changed some of the characters. While we kept Spock, because I guess they liked him, they changed him a little bit. We'll get into all of that. The title itself, the name itself, is The Cage, but that really wasn't the name of the episode when they created it. They did call it The Menagerie, but when they did the Menagerie 2, they reused this pilot later on in a series, a season cliffhanger, a season-ending cliffhanger, and
first Star Trek clip show.
Exactly. Yeah. That was, I forget which season was that. I think it was between the second and third season. I think it was between the second and third. And they called that the Menagerie. So internally, they just started referring to this as the Cage instead in order to make a distinction. And it wasn't actually shown. This episode wasn't shown on its own on air until 2008 when it was shown in syndication, which is very interesting.
By the way, it wasn't a season-ending cliffhanger, but it was a two-parter with a cliffhanger.
Right.
It was? Oh, okay.
It was in the middle of the first season.
Oh, really? That's weird. Okay. For some reason, I had a different memory of that. So the basic plot line of it is it takes place 11 years before the original series, and when Kirk's captaincy, and the Enterprise is lured to this planet of Talos IV. Where Captain Pike, that's the captain, and others are captured and put in a zoo by telepathic beings for various nefarious reasons. So that's sort of the very basic story. So
and it's very reminiscent, and this is true of Star Trek as a whole, but it's very clear that one of the inspirations for this was the movie Forbidden Planet.
Yes.
We got ancient dead visiting a planet to find out what happened to a lost expedition. Beautiful young woman, we'll call her Vina this time instead of Alta like in Forbidden Planet. Got a alien race with dying or dead alien race with fantastic powers. This is Forbidden. And we've got the United Federation of Planets. This is Forbidden Planet.
Yes. So, a couple of things that kind of strike me right off the bat is first the opening credits is there's no voiceover. We don't get the this is the voyage of the Starship Enterprise, etc. We don't get that in this pilot. There's no narrative, just a lot of whooshing. And then
the familiar music, the famous music is there.
The music is in place. We get that first as we pan into the bridge, like you said, Father Corey. We go in through the sunroof. This
is a great shot for people who haven't seen it. We start with a long shot of the Enterprise, and we gradually zoom in, and they take a little bit of time doing this. It's a little slow for modern television, but they gradually zoom in on the Enterprise to give us and they did this deliberately to give us a sense of scale of how big this ship is. And then we zoom into the little top part of the saucer section where the bridge is located for no good reason. And then we zoom into that little circle at the top of the bump on the saucer section, and we see it's a skylight, and the entire bridge is down in there. And then we zoom into that and transition down into the bridge. It's a very effective long shot especially for the time.
And it gives us the scale, and it tells us where the bridge is. So from now on, we always know where the bridge of the Enterprise is when we're looking at the ship in the series.
I think, and just kind of say, as we start out talking here is, this is very recognizably Star Trek.
Yes.
I mean, this is very, but there's so many elements that have become known as Star Trek really were established in this this pilot. And yet there's enough differences too. Like the bridge is recognizably the bridge of the Enterprise,
right.
But it looks so different from what was done in the actual series.
It's a little more simple. There were less gewgaws and gadgets everywhere. The uniforms are different. Like you said, the gooseneck thingies, the viewers, I think those must have been taken out just from production reasons. They must have gotten in the way, all the time.
And it is interesting too, some of the, the more military aspects where there was a security guard on the bridge by the turbo lift.
Right. This guy just standing there the whole time.
There was an assistant that would stand there by the captain's chair when the captain was in the chair.
Yeah,
things like that.
Those were probably taken out for purely budgetary reasons. So,
exactly.
We can avoid paying these people if we don't make them stand.
Exactly.
Right. But also very much a connection to naval tradition. Those are things that exist on naval ships of the time, in our time, in the 1960s. And so there was that connection. Well, one of the things that was pretty daring that they did was that there was a woman first officer.
Number one.
Which they pointed out point blank, too.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not used to having a woman on the bridge. Oh, except you, number one. You're different.
Well, the weird thing is there was another woman on the bridge that he was standing behind 2 minutes before that.
They're a little inconsistent about all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, I thought it was interesting. Number one is sitting, even though she's first officer, she's sitting at what later, and of course this wasn't established at the time, but she's sitting at what was later established as the helm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Curious how that works.
Well, when you think about too, like where does the first officer go? Does he just stand next to the captain and then? Because in the original series, Spock was the science officer, so he had a place to be.
At the science station.
Yeah. So in this case,
it wasn't like DS or Next Generation where Riker was always sitting the next seat over.
Yeah. Having 3 seats would be interesting.
Incidentally, Spock gets I noticed Spock gets the very first line of the whole series. So he gets the first Star Trek line ever.
Yes. And he kind of, it check the circuit. It's very sort of, it's not great acting at that moment, on the part of Nimoy. He's a much better actor than that.
Yeah, and Nimoy has commented about his early acting in the role Spock, because initially, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but initially, number one was the one with no emotions.
Right.
Spock had emotions, and we will see that in this episode. And so he wasn't given the be stoic direction. Instead, he said, "Okay, well, I'm gonna kind of bellow out orders like a naval officer would."
Right.
And it took him a while to get over that.
Yeah. And I'm glad they did it in the unaired pilot, the initial unaired pilot. One of the things that will strike us, the viewer, is the corridors. Like they were very busy, but the original series, the corridors were very busy. But there were a lot of people
until the third season.
Yes, when the budget got cut. But there were a lot of people in civilian clothes, kind of wandering around, which is very interesting.
Yeah, we see this couple like they're just coming back from a swimming pool or something, and the woman is wearing a skirt, and the guy is wearing kind of a t-shirt and shorts.
Yeah,
and they're very clearly civilian clothes. These aren't any kind of Star Trek uniform. They've just been like having a date at the swimming pool or tennis court or something.
Yeah, I was gonna say hit the tennis court on the ship or something.
Well,
they look very much like 1960s leisure wear.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, it sort of reminds me of in the pilot episode of Next Gen, where we had the male officer walking down the corridor wearing a skirt. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Very daring. I noticed they never did that again.
Yeah.
Why can't men wear dresses, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, if they're kilts, it's okay.
Well, yeah. Well, hey, if it's a kilt, I'll go with it. So we quickly get into Captain Pike's internal conflict, which lies really at the heart of this episode. And
he's played by actor Jeffrey Hunter.
Yes, and in Pike, so we're kind of told that the Enterprise had just come from a devastating mission where people died under his command, and he's very conflicted to the point where he's thinking maybe I should just get out of this because I'm over having the responsibility of life and death. And so then
I've got 203 lives depending on me.
Yes, half as many as Kirk, Pike. So suck it up. So he has this conversation with the ship's doctor, Dr. Boyce, an older gentleman, elderly gentleman, the father figure in a sense, a confidant.
Encourages his patients to drink.
Yes, he brings in a box that apparently is a portable bartender kit and serves them a martini. Where we get some a great line about bartenders and doctors having similar roles.
And as a priest, bartender things he won't tell his doctor.
As a priest, I sympathize. People tell their bartenders things they won't tell their priest either.
Maybe priests should be standing at a bar sometimes.
Hey, so, anyways, I don't want to say anything that'll get me in trouble with my bishop. So.
So, Jimmy, you did say one thing that was that I want to comment on again is how much slower paced things are. All the special effects take much longer. Going to warp drive, the transporter effect, which, by the way, the transporter effect at the time was so advanced. When they first aired the final footage for the cast, who, of course, they don't get to see it happening while they're filming it. Right. When they saw the transporter effect the first time, there was applause in the audience of the cast and crew because it was so cool, so advanced. But everything takes longer.
Yeah, and part of that is because it is a pilot and they're showing off what they can do. They want to make sure that the suits see how cool this thing is that we're doing. And part of it's also that television was just slower paced back then. An example of that I have in my notes is once they finally get down onto Talos IV, they beam down and they have the note says stupid travel sequence. Because instead of just beaming down at the camp of the survivors, they beam down some distance away, and then we have to watch them laboriously walk towards where the survivor camp is. Yeah. But that gives us a great moment, which is in Star Trek history, which is they come across this Chinese money plant sitting on a rock that's been painted, and the Chinese money plant has been painted blue. So it's got little blue discs for its leaves, and Spock feels the blue leaves and smiles really broadly. And so
they're musical leaves, and when he touches them, they stop making the music, which that music was really annoying.
It was. That's why he's smiling.
It's stopping. Yay.
The smiling Spock. And so they came to this planet because they got a distress signal that it was an unexplored system. But an expedition from Earth had crashed there 18 years previously.
Which would be 2236, and the name of the lost ship this time is the Columbia.
The Columbia, right. And so there are apparently survivors, so they beam down, and they encounter this group of very old men in ragged clothes with very classic, we cobbled together this camp from the scraps of our crashed ship. Except for one beautiful young woman who was born pretty much as the ship was crashing, apparently. And so she's 18 years old, and Pike is looking at her. Pike has got to be how old? In his 30s, at least?
30s, yeah.
It was. 30s. I'm sorry, but that was kind of creepy. Pike was looking to hook up already with this the survivor girl from this.
It's going to get creepier once they get into the cage. Yeah.
Yes. So what do we have? We have she leads him off. I don't know where he thinks he's going.
She wants to show him something, and she leads him up to these rocks, and then all of a sudden, the entire encampment of survivors, except for her, vanishes.
Yep.
And the rocks she's led him up to open up, and these bulbous-headed aliens come out and squirt him with some powder, and he goes unconscious, and they drag him down into their subterranean lair.
Yes, the Talosians. I remember as a kid seeing the design of the Talosians, and the back of their head is kind of get this dimple. So of course they're the butt heads.
It looks like a. It looks like
a behind.
And they have They've got throbbing veins on their heads too.
They do. So, yeah, they've got some special effects air bladders.
Some hemorrhoid cream.
That's right. Yeah, those veins were. Yeah, every time they're using their mental telepathy, telekinesis powers, these veins throb, and I'm curious. They must have had some kind of like air hose running down the back of the costume or something.
They probably got a little hand pump that they're squeezing in their hand to make those throb.
Oh, jeez.
Okay, so enough of that. So Pike wakes up in a essentially a cage, and we quickly learn that there are other creatures in other cages nearby.
Really cool. We get little glimpses. We see shadows.
Yes.
We don't see a lot, but it's enough to show us there is a kind of alien menagerie here. It's a zoo of different kinds of alien creatures, and that's really neat. It's also a sci-fi trope that you see lots of places, but it's neat.
Well, I was going to mention how the Orville, which is an homage to Star Trek, kind of plays off of this with their episode in which the captain and his ex-wife first officer are put in a menagerie and they have to escape. And then they play the jokes off of that circumstance pretty well. So there is the one special effect of that pterodactyl-like creature where it's done in slow motion. Something must have gone wrong in the filming of it, where they didn't have enough seconds of footage that they could use, that they had to extend it out somehow or something, because it was very weird.
Something in the camera cranking, but I thought that kind of added to it. It's like it's so weird.
It made it very alien, and so it becomes clear very early on that these telepathic beings are trying to manipulate Pike into wanting to be there and wanting to hook up with Vina. And there's this whole...
They're putting him out to stud.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, so Vina, there's a whole Adam and Eve vibe to this episode. Vina offers, she's Eve, he's Adam.
I was going to say they were very explicit on that.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. And in fact, she offers him the forbidden fruit. I can be anything you imagine. That sort of thing.
Yeah, anything you want because of their telepathic powers. So that's when that's really creepy. I can be anything you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not true love.
And it's appealing to the basest nature of, human nature.
It's appealing to Gene Roddenberry's sexual fantasies is what it's doing, because he has a known tendency, and the writers would talk about this, that he was always trying to work his sexual fantasies into things.
Hence Kirk and all the multicolored women of the universe. It
gets way weirder.
But Pike isn't buying any of it. I mean, as much as Pike was conflicted earlier, he's not falling for the temptation. He's shown he's taken back to the battlefield that he just came from, and now given an opportunity to save the girl from the big bad Russian
damsel
alien.
in distress.
She's literally a damsel in distress. She's even dressed like she's out of a fairy tale.
Right, and then he's taken to his hometown with his horses in the Mojave Desert, which is now in the future is going to be green and lush, Jimmy.
And there is a town in the Mojave Desert that is called Mojave, California. So I assume what we're seeing there is the 23rd century version of Mojave.
It's going to be a nice neighborhood when we get there.
Very futuristic. So they show us initially the fairy tale princess. Then they show us essentially the girl next door.
Right.
Yeah.
Very
and
domestic.
When he doesn't go with either one of those, they show him the green slave chick.
Right.
And
Orion
so
slave girls.
We're going from, we're kind of descending the purity ladder as we go here.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's sort of that's another one of those sci-fi tropes that it's really unfortunate, because we get that in Star Wars, don't we? We get that with Princess Leia and the slave to Jabba the Hutt and the famous gold bikini. There's this tendency in science fiction. It's not wrong to sort of examine it and criticize it a little bit, to kind of say that it's to cater to that sort of juvenile fantasy in science fiction.
It's drawing on archetypes. I mean, there's in psychology, there are discussions of men being attracted to either the virgin archetype or the whore archetype. And that's what we've got going on here. They just added a third one in the middle of the girl next door who could be a reliable, competent wife.
Right.
She's neither the fairy tale princess who's, presumably so pure that she couldn't sleep on a mattress with a pea under it without noting that there's a pea under the mattress.
Right.
And then we've got the Orion slave chick who could teach anybody a thing or two. And we've got the competent spouse in the middle.
Right. And so, when as Pike rejects each of these in turn, each of these temptations, again, it's another bit of the temptation in the desert metaphor, like Christ in the desert. He rejects each one of these. And we learn that Vina is not, in fact, the projection of the Talosians, but she is herself a real human being who really crashed on the planet. And that the Talosians are an ancient race for whom dreams have become more important than reality.
Another sci-fi trope.
Yes.
And we need new input into our dream bank.
And so they've given, so she says, you give up travel, building, creating, and even forget how to repair the machines that have been left behind. So they just keep reliving the memories left behind. And when they've got bored of those, they started collecting specimens to breed so that you can live in their memories. And it's sort of a reaction to sort of over intellectualism in a sense that, if you're overly intellectual, if you forget that connection to the world, to the earth, to the more, those aspects of life, it's a dangerous thing, I guess is the...
So you're saying I don't know how to repair my own iPhone and just keep watching the same YouTube videos over and over again?
And posting to Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram? Yeah,
well, and it's interesting, too, that this was done at a time when TV was still new technology.
Right.
And it's almost kind of a warning saying, don't get too caught up in this.
Well, it was a time when technology was advancing by leaps and bounds in all areas of life. And so a sort of warning about that, and about technology becoming a crutch.
And of course, as technology has gone forward and we're talking about the internet and YouTube and all that, how many people, here's a simple thing, how many people know how to change the oil in their car?
Oh,
it's not a difficult task.
It depends on how recently you bought your car. They made it more difficult.
Well, I've got a 2012 sitting out here that I don't even have to jack up to change the oil on. Changing the oil is since the invention of the car has always been considered, a task that anybody can do.
A rite of passage, even.
A rite of passage. How many people, or another analogy, how many people know how to plant a garden?
Yep.
Things like that, things that for much of humanity, or at least much of the invention of something, has been taken for granted. But we're losing, many people are losing that. They don't know what to do. What happens when your car breaks down? What do you do? What happens, if
call AAA?
Exactly.
Well, that's led to actually a lot of current sci-fi that kind of posits an apocalyptic world where what happens when the machines stop working? How do we survive?
Right.
Exactly.
So this is kind of playing on that.
Yeah. So in this episode of Sci-Fi, we eventually find out what the Enterprise is doing while their captain has been kidnapped. And one thing that I think is really cool is they bring down a laser cannon. Yeah, and this is the only time in Star Trek we ever get to see a laser cannon in operation. But it is so awesome. And initially, it doesn't look like the laser cannon is doing anything. It's just blasting and blasting and blasting, and that stuff's getting hot, and some little bits of rock are flying off. But basically, the doors look impregnable. Right. But later, once they realize the Talosians can create mental illusions, they get to see what the laser cannon really did, and it blew off the entire rock face.
Well, that was
really cool.
One thing I really liked was that they knew quite early that the Talosians could make illusions, and I think it was Dr. Boyce who said something along the lines of, "Well, we could have blown the top off of that rock formation, but we can't. We never know because we can't trust anything we see."
Pretty much did. The big chasm in the middle of the rock there, and it's split.
Right. Yeah. And that was a nice element. Is they knew that all of whatever efforts they were taking, they had no way of knowing whether it was actually working or not.
Right.
And that feeds into the danger in this episode because, as Vina points out, they can make you think you're pushing any button they want you to, including the self-destruct button.
Right. Exactly. And at one point, the transporter chief is tricked into beaming down number one and the yeoman to the surface, and nobody else.
But not Spock and the others. At which point Spock has a great line. He goes, "The women!"
That was another great Spock moment in this episode. And they're beamed down by the Talosians because obviously Pike doesn't like the one they've been offering, so maybe he'll want one of these other two. And we have this embarrassing moment where they're reading the minds of the women about how they really feel about the captain. And
and they're also talking about the benefits of breeding with respectively. So number one, you're going to have a very intelligent offspring. If you mate with the yeoman, though, she's very healthy and has very healthy sexual appetite. She's previously considered you unattainable, but is now beginning to realize her situation has changed.
And she turned about as red as her hair.
Well, it's very interesting. We get their fantasies or their attraction, but they never are able to tell us what Pike's is, partly because Pike is using this technique he's figured out of filling his mind with hate to block their
kind of based off the conversation with the doctor earlier in the episode. He mentioned going and being an Orion trader.
Well, yeah,
and I think that scene was kind of his fantasy.
Yeah, in that initial bartender scene, they basically talk through his fantasies, and then we get to see each one of them.
Right. One of the things we didn't mention about the Orion thing is, again, the Gene Roddenberry, unfortunate his proclivities. We're told by a Starfleet officer apparently that Orion it's a planet of women who like to be taken advantage of.
Yeah,
and like
animal slave women.
It's like ew, like this is like creepy. Like, suppose you had all of a space to choose from, and this was just one small sample. Wouldn't it be worth a man's soul? I'm like, no.
Yeah, no kidding.
I mean, a very clear reference to the biblical verse, right?
And it's, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? And that's not the only religion reference in here. We've also got a moment when the Talosians are trying to get Pike to comply, and they don't seem to realize, by the way, there's 203 other people up on that ship that are presumably split into two sexes that we could some of them might go for this offer.
right.
But you got to have the captain. You got to have the top of the food chain.
Yeah. But anyway, they're kind of they're torturing him mentally, and they put him in hell, and it's very clearly hell. It's like he's surrounded by fire. It's kind of it's subterranean. It's kind of an interesting visualization of hell, because there's also like pools of some liquid there. I'm sure it's really water, but what it's meant to be, you have this fire and water subterranean hell.
Sort of lava.
And the Talosian says, "From a fable you once heard in childhood." and then says hell is considered a fable by Gene Roddenberry in this episode.
Right.
And the Talosian then says, "There are even less pleasant things lurking in your subconscious we could show you."
Yeah, well, I think in all of us, probably.
Exactly.
So by the end of this, well, actually, I wanted to make one more point about offering Vina and number one and the yeoman. Is that at no point do they ever just say, "Look, you can have all three of them. We're better off if we have more breeding."
Exactly.
But it's interesting, sort of the assumption on the part of the writers and producers, and probably because the morality of the audience that they're taking into account is the idea is, if you want your captain to be the sort of guy who's only going to be with one woman, and you don't want to even enter into
they even talked about how the Talosians wanted to have this man and woman in a happy husband and wife relationship, and it made that explicit. And then that's where the vision of her as his wife came about.
Yes, so it was very clearly a monogamous relationship that they were going for.
Oh, wow. I just realized something. And they would never have been able to do this on TV back then. But since they can make you think anybody looks like anybody else, if they ever got you to buy on this offer, they could have you breed with as many different people as they wanted you to.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Mm-hmm. And neither of you would know of you or any other people would know what you were doing. Yeah, it's the Talosian power is creepy when you start to think about it.
Yeah,
but in the end, go ahead.
I was going to say, so as we're getting towards the end, so once Spock realizes at a certain point that this is hopeless, he's getting ready to leave.
Right.
Which is amazing. I mean, like, he would never just leave Kirk.
Right.
Which shows how different his character is at this point. And when, and then number one, of course, takes charge of the situation, which is great. That's her job. At one point, to save others, like Pike volunteers to like kind of cooperate, but it's interesting. In the end, we have this kind of weird I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of a downbeat ending.
Right.
Because they reveal to us, I mean, number one points out to Vina, there was a Vina on the crew manifest for the Columbia as an adult crew woman. She wasn't born 18 years ago. Yeah, so she's like in her 30s at least. At this point. And they then show us Vina's true form, and she's very deformed because of, and they tell us it's because of the injuries she suffered in the crash. And the Talosians rebuilt her and did their best, but they didn't have any guide in rebuilding a woman, which really makes no sense, because if they can access her mind, I mean, they clearly know her mental image of herself because they're using it with Pike. Right. And so it's like, use her own mental image as a guide for what she should look like. Exactly. But then they have this ending where, they've concluded that that Pike's will is too strong and humans are not a suitable successor species, even though they should have been able to tell that from Vina. Right. And so now, because Vina's deformed, she's going to stay with them and live with a fantasy Pike on this planet. So she gets a sort of creepy, happy ending. And then the ship just leaves. Yeah. And it's kind of a weird downbeat ending. Which they sort of fix in the menagerie, because conveniently they have that scene of Vina and Pike walking off together into the Talosian fantasy world. Reuse and reinterpret that footage. Yeah, it's which is very interesting that they had that to be able to do that. The Talosians conclude that humans are uniquely unsuitable for captivity, preferring to die than be captured, even when the captivity is pleasant. And I'm thinking, that's unique? Like, other creatures are not okay with this? I'm
sure Klingons would love that. I'm sure Klingons would love to be captive slaves.
Yeah. We have enough trouble with pandas.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. So then we kind of wrap things up as has become traditional in Star Trek with our triumvirate on the bridge, kind of talking together, and I forget exactly what the context is. The Vina and the was supposed to be Eve, and the doctor's like, Eve as in Adam, and Pike responds, as in all ships' doctors are dirty old men.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
the yeoman asks, sir, just out of curiosity, who was going to be Eve? Yeah. To which he gets yelled at by number one.
Yeah, because he's got three options. The yeoman is still thinking about who would it have been.
Exactly.
that yeoman is not the smartest crewman on the ship. That's for sure. I have a feeling she got transferred.
Very healthy offspring.
Yes. I have a feeling she got transferred to a new ship after that.
And then Pike gets the final line, engage.
Yes, which is an interesting. We'll see that again in Star Trek, which is nice. I wonder if that was intentional in the Next Gen, whether that was an intentional callback or not. I wonder. So, anything else you want us to be said about the cage? Any other?
I just had two little notes. One of them is we later learn in the menagerie that this planet has been made the subject of what's called General Order Number 4. Right. And General Order Number 4 is do not go to Talos IV. That's it.
Right.
And that shows you how the fact this is General Order number 4 it indicates how seriously they take don't go to Talos 4, because the prime directive is General Order number 1.
Right.
This is only 3 ranks below that. And you can imagine why they would want to not go there, because if the Talosians decided, hey, why should we stay on this rock? Let's go out into the galaxy and do stuff. They would be amazingly dangerous. So if you're not going to genocide them, avoiding all contact with them is the logical thing to do.
Given that they had no space flight.
Yeah. Also, I thought it was interesting in that number 1 has blue nails. She paints her nails blue, whereas red would have been the common color at the time. But they reflect, I guess, her kind of cool personality.
Okay.
That also reminds me. So there were 2 characters that were criticized heavily by the suits after they saw the cage. One was Spock and one was number 1. And Roddenberry realized he wasn't going to get the show greenlit if he kept both of them. And so he compromised and told Majel Barrett, who wasn't yet his wife, I'm sorry, we'll create something else for you, but I've got to lose number 1 because I think it's really, really important we have an alien in this crew. And so he kept Spock as a compromise, lost number 1. She, of course, was crushed because this was a really great part. And Christine Chapel was not on the same level as number 1 would have been. But that's how the Spock number 1 exchange happened. And then number 1's emotionlessness was transferred to Spock.
Right. One thing I was going to point out, speaking of red, there were no red shirts, because that's the famous trope in Star Trek of the red shirts who always die. But there was only the yellow, green, whatever color it was, in blue. For the uniforms.
Yeah, that's very, the uniforms was another interesting little bit. And the Doctor had a sort of duty uniform versus, working in the sickbay uniform versus it was like a jumpsuit versus other uniforms. And even they're
really fuzzy. They look like they're velour or something.
Yeah, I know. They must have been really hot to wear those under the studio lights, which is probably why we got much lighter materials later on. But they also had sort of their away mission gear. They had a jacket and a harness, and they hung things on them, and I mean it was very, very much more than what we eventually got was like basically Velcro under the shirt for the communicator and the phaser in later on. So those were very interesting. So I think that sort of wraps up what we have to say about the cage. And I want to just encourage people to like and to share this episode with other folks, and share the podcast with folks, and let them know that we're doing it and that they might enjoy it, especially if they're Star Trek fans, of course. So that's it from us. What did you think of the original pilot episode, The Cage? We will be dealing with this again, presumably when we talk about the menagerie, but this was just about The Cage. So let us know by visiting sqpn.com/trek. Or the SQPN Facebook page, and leave us some feedback there, or send us an email to trek@sqpn.com, and we'll put links to our social media and our personal websites on our show notes at sqpn.com. We'll be back next time when we'll be discussing the original series pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, which was not the first episode of Star Trek aired. So that we'll talk about that then. Until then, Jimmy Akin, thank you for joining me in sharing the secrets of Star Trek.
My pleasure.
Father Corey Stika, thank you as well.
Yeah, glad to be here, and thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening. And remember, you either live life, bruises, skin knees and all, or you turn your back on it and start dying. This is Dom Bettinelli again. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and that you'll help us keep producing the podcast you love. Thank you for your generosity. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give.